Okay, good evening, everybody. Hello, and welcome to LNG Unpacked, Faith, Climate, and Community Action. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and spending this hour with us. This is the second webinar in our four-part LNG Unpacked webinar series, where we are aiming to increase climate literacy, specifically focused on LNG. And we're focusing each of our webinars on a different sector. So of course, tonight we are focusing on faith, and we'll be talking a lot about the interconnections between various faith communities and faith beliefs and the climate crisis and climate action. And we're so excited to have three incredible speakers. They'll all be speaking from their own experience. I don't know exactly what each of them are going to be talking about, so I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. And I want to start us off with a land acknowledgement. I'm sure the majority of you who are joining this call tonight are located in so-called British Columbia. I am actually currently in what is known as Toronto, which is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit on Treaty 13 territory. This image on the screen, however, is an image of the Skeena River. And I took this photo in the summer when I was visiting northern BC in Kispiox. And this area that you can see here is traditional and unceded Gitxsan territory. And the reason why I put this image up here and why I wanted to talk about this area in particular is because the Gitxsan are one of a number of Indigenous nations in so-called British Columbia that are at the very heart of a number of fossil fuel project fights that are going on right now. They are facing a lot of challenges because these projects are trying to get pushed through their territory despite the opposition of their hereditary chiefs. And so they are doing everything that they can to be opposing these various fossil fuel projects, including a number of natural gas projects. And I just wanted to acknowledge that because every time we talk about climate justice and are working towards climate action, we need to always keep in mind that this is also about Indigenous sovereignty, and that should always be at the center of our climate action. And we'll be speaking more shortly about kind of the specific projects that will be impacting not only Gitxsan territory, but other territories throughout BC. So to start us off tonight, we'll be hearing first from our three speakers. After that, I will be providing the overview about LNG. And then hopefully we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So we have scheduled it to have about 10 minutes or so. So if you do have a question that pops up while the speakers are going, feel free to pop those into the chat. And I hope we'll be able to get to them at the end. We are aiming to wrap up within 1 hour. So we hope to get you out of here by 8 p.m. So I did forget to introduce myself. My name is Emiko Newman, and I'm the coordinator of the BC Climate Emergency Campaign, which is a coalition of groups who have come together to push the BC government to take more urgent climate action and to call for a real climate emergency plan, because BC's current climate plan is not really doing the job. The BC Climate Emergency Campaign brings together dozens and dozens of groups from so many different types of sectors, and we have 615 organizations who have signed on in support of our call to action to the government. And so if you're joining tonight and you're part of an organization who has not become one of our signatories, we would love to have you, and we'll provide information towards the end about how you can do that. The other three folks on this page here are our wonderful speakers, and I will be passing it over to them now. And we're going to be starting off with Maryam Gamar. Maryam was born on Treaty 7 territory and raised on unceded Musqueam and Coquitlam land. She comes from a mixed North African, Pakistani, and Quebecois family. She works as a broadcast journalist and TV producer at CBC Vancouver. And as of last year, she's been working on a Master's of Education in Sustainability at UBC. Her area of interest is developing educational materials for Muslim leaders by combining faith-based knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing with climate action and community work. She also volunteers with the Muslim environmental group Green Ummah, whom she is representing tonight. And based on that incredible bio, you can clearly see that she is the perfect person to be talking about faith and climate connections. And I'm super excited to have you here. So Maryam, over to you.
Thank you so much, Emiko. It's so great to be here, and I'm so glad that everyone could make it out tonight. And I'm honored to be one of the people kind of setting the tone for tonight. So I wanted to start with, I'm doing my master's in education and sustainability, but I am very new to this kind of work. So instead of talking about what I have done, I wanted to talk about what drew me to this work. And to me, the significance of including faith-based knowledge in our climate action systems is that we can get specific and zoom into what really matters to a community. So for me, one of my first experiences with environmental education was being taught that in Islam, we believe that the earth can feel our footsteps. And if we walk gently on it, it will come to know us and will grieve us when we die. And the opposite is also true according to the teaching. If we mistreat the earth or pollute it, it won't miss us, and kind of our death will be kind of a relief on the earth. So that story really shaped how I think about my relationship with the earth, partly because it fit right into the worldview I was forming based on the belief system and values that I was being socialized into. And I didn't really define it as faith-based knowledge because it wasn't separate from other types of learning. It was very integrated into what I was learning about, like the ozone layer or pollution or recycling. But then when I started learning about these things in school, I felt really stripped from that specificity. And it was very rooted in science, but not in our personal connection with the land. And I really felt that we need to have both of those things, the more emotional and then the more scientific. And so it really ended up feeling like I was coming at it from a roundabout way that never really fully aligned with my worldview and the way I was raised. I think today, we see non-Western perspectives left out of climate action all the time. And at this point in the climate crisis, we really need to be thinking creatively, and relying on those dominant systems is not working well enough anymore. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because it's not able to get everybody on board. And, if we think about it, one system can't really do that. There is not one system that can get everybody on board. So, for me, from the angle that I'm working from a Muslim perspective. So I have to add on to that the varying proximity to immigration, people's comfortability with English. Those things are often barriers to Western education. And if there's nothing that people can latch onto that is familiar, they're likely to reject it. And unfortunately, climate action is one of those things that's not necessarily directly applicable to a lot of people's lives. It's easy to ignore if you're not felt like you're being brought in or welcomed in. So environmental education and climate action really have to be rooted in the values of the communities they're being applied to. Someone who I'm really relying on and drawing on in my master's work is Mi'kmaq scholar Albert Marshall. Some of you might be familiar, but he came up with the two-eyed seeing framework, which encourages us to look at the world with both Indigenous and Western perspectives. And that kind of combines the strengths of both to create a fuller, more holistic understanding. And it also helps us understand that multiple truths can coexist. So maybe one person would advocate for protecting salmon because of that species' importance to upholding the ecosystem in a biological sense, while someone else might say it's because salmon are part of a relational community and are important in their role as teachers. And that doesn't mean that one is right and wrong, one is right and one is wrong. You know, both can kind of coexist, and we can find benefits to both of those things. So if we apply that framework, and we can really apply that framework to any community. In my master's degree work, I've been referring to this framework as three-eyed seeing because I'm working in the intersection of Western, Indigenous, and Muslim knowledge systems. Obviously, this doesn't really work as well because we only have two eyes, but I'm kind of trying to go with it. But I felt like it was also important to, you know, not make it my own version of two-eyed seeing by cutting out Indigenous knowledge because, you know, I'm working on Musqueam land. It's important, Emiko kind of alluded to this in climate action work, to acknowledge whose land it is that we're trying to heal and on whose land we're doing this work. So I wanted to, you know, kind of tying that all together, I wanted to share another teaching that is an example of how I want to root climate action in Islamic teachings while still keeping the integrity of the message and the call to action. So something that we're taught, it's kind of, there's a lot of Muslim teachings that are kind of oral traditions. So I've always heard these things in story form. But according to this teaching, we are taught that if the last day or the end of time begins and you are holding a sapling or any plant, if you're capable of planting it, then you should do so, even if the world is ending around us. And this teaching is often used to encourage Muslims to do good in dire times or near the end of our lives. But I think it can also benefit, or we can benefit from the literal meaning. Plant trees even when the land is burning or there's a water shortage, or even if it might get cut down in a couple of years. You know, to me, the value of this teaching is in encouraging us to keep going with our work, whether we see immediate impact or not. Sometimes, you know, especially after this summer and the past couple summers we've had, if we look outside, it kind of does look like the world is ending in some ways. But this teaching is an encouragement to keep planting those seeds, even though we might not see them grow because somebody else down the line might. So all of this is to say that in integrating faith-based knowledge into climate action, we are able to stay true to the context and needs of our specific communities and offer a way to maintain hope through those worldviews. So, you know, my hope is that tonight is one of those actions that gives us some of the tools that we need to keep doing this work. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Maryam. Wow, I wish we could hear you for another half an hour or longer. But thank you so much. I just want to remind our participants tonight that if you have questions for the speakers, we really encourage you to put those into the chat and we can get to them at the end. But yeah, thank you, Maryam. The three-eyed seeing, I do know about two-eyed seeing, but I've never heard of the three-eyed seeing. So that's something new, and I like that you've penned that. And I also think it's really important what you shared at the very end about planting seeds, planting trees, even when it feels like the world is ending, even when it feels like there's no hope left to be found. But it's important to plant anyways and hope that future generations will be able to see the fruits of your labor. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your learnings with us, and I hope that your master's continues to be an inspiration for you.
Thank you.
We're gonna pass it right along to our second speaker. I know it's 1 hour where you're trying to jam a lot in here, so they'll be moving pretty quickly. Our second speaker is Reverend Harold Munn. And Reverend Harold has led congregations ranging from the tiniest of churches in Canada's far north to All Saints Cathedral in Edmonton, Alberta. He is an associate of the International Society for Ordained Scientists, has received all sorts of awards for his writing, and holds degrees in classics theology and a doctorate in research on secularism and faith. He has been active in movements opposing nuclear war, supporting social justice, and urging action to address climate collapse. Reverend Munn currently lives on the UBC campus and with his wife of 50 years, which is very impressive. Reverend Harold, over to you.
Thanks, Emiko, and wonderful to have people part of this conversation that's so important this evening. Yes, I suppose I'm of a longevity where 50 years, well, 51 years now with my spouse has been a delight. And she is the one who makes it a delight. And we've been very fortunate in that. One of the things that brings me to where I am is that some of my childhood was spent growing up in Lytton, for people who are in BC, that small town may ring some bells. A couple of years ago, it burned down. The temperature was just under 50 degrees Celsius, halfway to the point of boiling. But when I grew up there, yes, it was probably in the mid 40s most summers, and I was an only child there, and both mixed with First Nations kids. I remember looking at well, now called story poles, but traditionally called totem poles, and a kid of my age, like 7 or 8 years old, said, "Oh," I said, "What are the shapes on the totem pole?" The child said back to me, "Oh, well, that one's a frog." It didn't look a lot like a frog to me. I said, "How do you know it's a frog?" And he said, "Because it's green." And I began to appreciate the different ways in which different cultures see the world. And that small experience stayed with me. Later, marvelous Emiko, to have that shot of the Skeena River. My family later moved to Prince Rupert and saw a lot of the Skeena River and the Nass, and was with the people on the Nass and subsequently in the Yukon. And that constant experience of the integration of a culture with the world in which we live, deep integration, has been part of what's brought me to this place. That sense that we are part of the world, the creatures, bears, ravens, eagles, and so on, are spirited creatures in which we are in constant and deep relationship, I think is something that would be of enormous benefit to our culture. It strikes me that in our culture, the world is a thing which we get to exploit in whatever way our culture wants. And the LNG, of course, is the latest in a series of methods by which our culture treats the world as an unvaluable thing, except so far as it can make widgets for us. I think faiths have an alternative worldview that is really essential at this time, which is that, well, on one hand, there's a kind of humility. It's not really all about us. Our species is a very, very recent latecomer in the history of life. It's clearly not all about us. And I think that sense allows us to return to a relationship with the planet, with its life, which is glorious and wonderful. Those who've been to UBC perhaps have seen in the Museum of Biodiversity, that enormous whale. I stood under it with some sort of semi-grandchildren recently, just awed. Those creatures swam in the ocean, and they developed from, I don't know what the latest theory is, but perhaps they emerged from pigs originally. And their skeleton is so utterly different from those of other mammals. And none of them thought about it. The whales didn't think it through and think, let's have a different shape and we can eat krill in the ocean. There is something about that process that is staggering and marvelous. And I think that attitude is something which faiths encourage because of various stories about creation. And it reconnects us to the goodness, the deep goodness that the universe emerges from. And that is part of who we are. And we are part of something very much larger than ourselves. One of the concerns I experience is experience it myself, but I hear it from many other people. The sense of, on the one hand, grief that if our political priorities don't change, it looks like there may well be a climate collapse, and that will be dreadful because there will be a social collapse that goes along with that. And on the other hand, not just the grief, but also the despair that it's very easy to begin to say, we've been working on this for decades, and it looks like it's getting worse. And I think the religious experience has something important to say to that, which is that if this universe has emerged from deep goodness, because if it had emerged from evil, it would have self-destructed long ago. If it has emerged from deep goodness, which religions call God or various terminologies, ultimate reality, however you want to name that, if that's true, then in the end, the destruction that's happening and that humanity is, let's say, parts of humanity have brought upon us isn't the last word in what is ultimately real. And I think the songs, the music, the ceremony that goes with religions is a really, really important way of reconnecting people with a deep hope that in the end, may not be in our lifetime, may not be in the lifetime of the cosmos, for all I know, but in the end, all is well. And I deal with my own despair and my own grief by re-immersing myself in that week by week, day by day, to remember that, in fact, it's not all about me, it's not all about us, it's about something unspeakably extraordinary, which I experienced recently standing underneath that whale. And I think that's the kind of thing our society needs. Because if really the earth is about providing widgets for us, really there's no hope and no joy and no deep delight. So I think that's perhaps really all I want to say. Other than that, when the despair and the grief come to us, they can be all-consuming. I think being relieved from those two deep, difficult issues through the humility that it's not all about us, when we're relieved of that, then there is an energy released in us that allows us to take the kind of action that the climate emergency process is commending, and the ability to challenge assumptions about what society and the world is about, and to take the difficult stands about matters like justice, justice for all, justice for cultures, justice for languages. I think all that is open to us if we are grounded in that sense that there's a deep goodness behind all things. I could go on forever, but shan't. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Harold. Your words were very calming, I found. I feel calmer after listening to you and very hope-filled. We didn't tell all of our speakers, hey, talk about hope, but you did. And I think that's really important. And I'm even seeing that as a common thread already between our first two speakers. And I think humility is crucial, as you spoke about, Reverend Harold, the feeling of looking up and seeing that massive whale skeleton. I've seen that for myself, and I know that feeling.
It's
so
astonishing, isn't it?
It is astonishing, and that's such an important reminder. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to pass it to our third speaker, Abhay Sachal. Abhay is a Canadian youth climate justice activist whose research and work resides at the intersection of climate change, eco-anxiety, mental health, and spirituality. He's the founder of Break the Divide, which is a nonprofit organization that equips young people with resources to understand their climate emotions and connects communities with one another to build resilience. Abhay has been recognized as one of Canada's top 25 under 25 environmentalists, which is huge, and has been listed amongst the 100 most influential Sikhs from around the world. Unbelievable. He also works with the Climate Mental Health Network and the Mental Health Climate Change Alliance, and is currently a student at the University of Regina, completing a Master's of Education. I'm seeing a theme here between our various speakers. Over to you, Abhay.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emiko, and thanks so much, everyone, for having me here. I'm really excited to be chatting about this really important topic, faith and the environment and how they connect. I'm excited to share a bit about myself and my journey sort of into environmental action, climate justice action, and talk a bit about a Sikh perspective, thinking about the Sikh religion. Sikhism is the world's fifth largest religion, and in Canada and in BC in particular, has a particular presence. And so I'll share a bit about how sort of this worldview, a spiritual worldview from Sikhi, has impacted my life and how it sort of guides the ways that I think about these issues. Uh, my name is Abhay. I'm from Surrey, British Columbia. So BC, all of these topics, thinking about BC is really sort of near and dear to me. I currently live in Regina, Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 lands here, where I'm working to complete my master's in educational psychology. And I'm training to be a psychologist. Through my work at Break the Divide, a nonprofit that Emiko introduced, like we work with young people across Canada talking about exactly what we've been talking about through this conversation already: the despair, the grief, the anxiety, the fear, the hopelessness, the anger, all the emotions that come up with the state of the climate crisis right now. I think everyone in this room knows that we're in a climate crisis. Moving to Saskatchewan, that was actually more of the case than you'd expect, actually. I've lived here for 2 years, and moving to Saskatchewan, from the drought that farmers experience to the extreme heat, people see the climate crisis. And living in Toronto, working across Canada, like we see and we experience and we understand that we are in the midst of a climate crisis. Growing up in BC, I felt such a strong connection with the environment, with nature. When I was 14 years old, I had the opportunity to travel to the Arctic, where I saw the impacts of climate change firsthand. I was in Nunavut and Greenland and northern Labrador, seeing the impacts of climate change, like glaciers melting in front of my eyes. And there again, I remember being 14, literally being on top of the world, but also feeling the burden of the world on top of my shoulders. And so I think about young people that we work with at Break the Divide, where I've talked to 13-year-olds in rural Ontario that talk about how they can't sleep at night because of climate change. A 16-year-old in BC that I worked with talked about how this was amidst a provincial election cycle a couple years ago, how he was, again, another theme here, not sleeping because he was canvassing for better politics and better environmental action for over 10 hours every single day while doing school. And so I think, we should not underestimate the burden that climate change is taking on the mental health of everyone, but in particular young people. And beyond thinking about anxiety for the future, there's a complex and so many emotions that come up. Like, again, last stat that I'll share here, that in a 2021 survey of 10,000 young people around the world, over 50% said that they think humanity is doomed because of climate change. Over 40% said that they're unsure if they want to have children. And over 70% said that the future is frightening. And so this is the world that we're bringing young people into, that young people are existing in. And this is largely because of the education and information and awareness of the climate crisis that is compounded by experiencing the climate crisis too, experiencing the heat waves, the extreme, the wildfires, the smoke. And so when I think about that, at Break the Divide, our work really empowers young people with connection to emotions, environment, identity, and community. Something that Maryam said earlier, that, grounding people in a sense of connection to culture is incredibly important to reach different communities. Something we do at Break the Divide is foster resilience through belonging and connection, and fostering a connection with these different topics. Through my work in I was a part of the inaugural Environment and Climate Change Canada Youth Council from 2022 to 2024, where I advised Minister Guilbeault and Prime Minister Trudeau and a whole team of folks at Environment Canada about youth perspectives on the climate crisis. I also worked as a part of the United Nations Environmental Program Interfaith Youth Council, sharing sort of Sikh perspectives on the environment. And so through this journey, I would really say that what's guided me and I think really kept me grounded in a lot of different ways amidst the despair, amidst the grief, amidst all the emotions that come up has been my Sikh faith. Growing up in BC with a strong Sikh community around me as well, I think I learned through my family, through my parents, and through the community a lot about how in Sikhi we conceptualize the environment and the world. And a critical thing that I think is really key that I found really helpful for my own journey and that I share is this fundamental idea of ik oangar in Sikhi. So this idea of ik oangar refers to a universal oneness. this oneness that exists beyond time, beyond space. This oneness has no fear, has no hate, and this oneness is everywhere. It's everything. And so there is no other in a Sikh worldview. And the history of Sikhi sort of actually brings up this idea of oneness in many different ways. It's actually an incorporation of the idea of equality. If we are all one, we are all fundamentally equal. And so looking at Sikh history, through incorporating and trying to institutionalize that oneness. At the time in the Punjab in northern India, only emperors, only rulers, only royalty were wearing turbans at that time. And so the Sikh gurus, our teachers at that time, gave the turban to everyone as the symbol of royalty and sovereignty and fundamental equality. And so as I think about that history and that commitment to justice, that really ignites how I think about other people in this fight, that working on issues of environment and environmental justice is not just about the land, it's about people, but it is fundamentally about the environment and nature as well, because that environment and nature is a part of that oneness as well. There's no separation. And so I think that sort of fundamental worldview of like this, there's no disconnection, there's no disconnect, we are all one and we are all a part of this fundamental thing. Like that has been really grounding and important for me amidst sort of my journey. And another really critical Sikh perspective has been this idea of seva, of selfless service, sort of really guiding the way that I think about these topics. As I think about sort of moving forward and how we engage, I mean, again, the fact that hope has come up so much already as a theme is really inspiring for me, actually, because it reminds me that many of us feel this burden of the climate crisis, and amidst the despair and the grief and, again, the hopelessness of it all. One Sikh perspective that is really guiding me, one principle, is this idea of Chardi Kala. Chardi Kala refers to being in rising spirits even amidst crisis. And actually, it refers to times where Sikhs were being persecuted. And this time of, even when you're living in the jungle, even when you're being persecuted, even when you're incredibly marginalized, you have rising spirits and you have this eternal optimism. Because despite how bad things are, despite how bad things are in this material world, we all have access to this deeper universal oneness and this connection with everything. And so again, like when I hear the isolation and the fear and the aloneness that a lot of young people especially experience, and I think about my own journey through that, it reminds me of how, again, I am connected to something really much greater than me. And so I guess in closing, I think one thing that I think faith can really provide is the sense of resilience. Obviously, the access to different worldviews is so important, and going beyond just the scientific and purely logical, but connecting with the deeper faith and cultural roots of our faith systems amidst the multiple crises that we face in the world today, I think it's incredibly important. Um, Really from multiple communities lenses, and I think understanding that this knowledge is inherent to Canada. Like this knowledge has existed in Canada and is inherent to Canada, whether it's Indigenous worldviews, to the lands that we live on, to the multiple people that have here. Like this first Sikhs arrived in British Columbia in 1897. So again, like that's 30 years after Confederation. The first Sikh Gurdwara, the Casa de Society in Vancouver, was established in 1908. And so I think in closing here, really like I'm so interested whenever I have the chance to learn from different worldviews and different cultures. Let's think about how we do that in our own lives and create spaces of belonging where we can open up conversations to different ways of accessing this resilience amidst the climate crisis. So I'll end there, and I'm really excited for the rest of the discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Abhay. I think the concept that stuck out the most strongly to me was the idea of the universal oneness. And when you were talking about that, I couldn't help but think about the contrast with the current capitalist dominant worldview that kind of structures our world right now, and how at odds it is with the idea of oneness, and how what we have instead is hierarchies, and we have humans at the very top, and then creatures below us, and the land on the bottom that is just there to be used, and we destroy. And I'm struck by how powerful the idea of the universal oneness is, and how much that's lacking in this kind of dominant worldview. that we have. But again, the hope was very strong, a strong current throughout what you just shared. And I'm really just processing what you shared and our two previous speakers shared. And I think I'll be thinking about all of your words for quite a while. So thank you. I feel bad that we have to kind of like rush on to the next part of the webinar, but we're gonna get into the second half of this session, which is the educational aspect around LNG. So allow me to just share my screen once more and we will get into that. All right, is this visible for everybody? Great. So tonight we've been talking broadly about the climate crisis, but as you know, we wanted to focus this webinar specifically on LNG, or liquefied natural gas, because we are at a key turning point in our country's history. And there is a lot of momentum that has suddenly built up around LNG. So in particular, back in July, Canada started exporting LNG for the very first time. Before that, we had never sent our natural gas abroad, but now we are exporting. It's coming from Kitimat LNG Canada is the name of the export terminal. And this has big implications for folks across the country. And that's what we're going to be talking about largely tonight. There's a lot of other things happening as well. Back in June, we saw a pipeline approved. This is the Prince Rupert Gas Transmission Pipeline, which was approved despite intense opposition from Indigenous hereditary chiefs, from a number of climate organizations and others, and yet it was still pushed through. And that's not, oops. Oh, just a second. It took me to the very end of the PowerPoint. One moment. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Actually, no, I can just go back here. There we go. Apologies for that. Okay, back on track. That's not the end. There's so much more that's coming. So Silisms is yet another LNG terminal that we were expecting to hear about an approval last week. So it's now a little bit overdue and it will be coming any day now. Woodfibre LNG is another terminal that is currently under construction. It's halfway complete. Cedar LNG, yet another one that's under construction. LNG Canada Phase 2, maybe you heard on the news today, it was included in the list of 5 major projects that our Prime Minister will now be fast tracking. And that will be doubling the size of the LNG Canada Phase 1 that I mentioned at the start there. Tilbury LNG, yet another LNG project that we are waiting to hear approval on. So there is a lot happening, and this is all happening in BC. So there are huge implications, especially for folks who live in BC. To back us up a little bit, what even is LNG? What are we talking about? So LNG is liquefied natural gas, but there is nothing good about natural gas. This is actually a prime example of greenwashing, making it sound better than it is, better for the climate than it is. Natural gas is primarily methane, and methane is a very potent fossil fuel. It traps 105 times more heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide over a 10-year time span. So you might hear people refer to natural gas as fracked gas or as methane gas, which is actually a really, I think, important little shift that we could make so that we're drawing attention to the fact that natural gas is not good and it is absolutely not clean. Natural gas is obtained through a process called hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Now, fracking itself is a horribly destructive process. What happens is that there's this water and mix of toxic chemicals that is injected deep down into the earth at enormous pressure that fractures the rock, so the gas then escapes and is captured. But the process of fracking is violent, honestly. You're cracking the rock apart to take the gas out, and the process uses billions of liters of fresh water that's taken from nearby lakes and rivers. Keep in mind, parts of BC have been experiencing a drought for years now, and yet the fracking industry is able to take up this fresh water. They're paying pennies for it. And the water is unable to enter back into the water cycle once it's been used for fracking, because it has become so toxic because of all these toxic chemicals that the water has to be kept in tailings ponds, which are covered, because if a bird lands on the water or if animals drink from it, they will die. That's how toxic this water is. It is removed permanently from the water cycle. Fracking also leads to earthquakes. There's a particular region called the Montney Formation, which is northeastern BC, bordering northwestern Alberta. They recorded 34 earthquakes last year just because of fracking. So it's clearly a very destructive process. And I want to draw your attention to this phrase here, that the idea that natural gas is cleaner than coal. So it's an important transition fuel to get other countries off coal. This might be something you've heard. I'm guessing you've heard it at some point or another. It's a very common talking point that you hear from politicians all the time, not to mention the industry itself. And so I want to speak to two parts of this sentence. First, the idea that natural gas is cleaner than coal. And I have a little graph to help me out here. So when you look at the emissions caused from burning coal and burning gas, it's true that coal releases more greenhouse gas emissions. The thing is, this is just one tiny snapshot of a larger picture. So let's look at the larger picture. Upstream emissions are the emissions that are released before the fuel is burned. So when you have coal and it's traveling on a train, these are just chunks of rock. Nothing is being emitted from them. Nothing happens until the coal gets burnt. But with gas, as I mentioned, natural gas is methane. And so methane is actually leaking across the entire life cycle. It has to be fracked, then it has to get processed, it has to be liquefied so it can be transported. It's taken long distances on ships. At the other side, it gets regasified and then burned. And through that entire process, methane is leaking. And methane is a potent greenhouse gas. And so you can see very clearly here that when you take all of that into consideration, gas is actually as bad or worse for the climate than coal. The second part of that sentence was that, well, we need gas to be replacing coal overseas in places like India and China. The fact is that that is not actually happening. We have very clear evidence that that is not happening. And I want to point your attention to a podcast episode that we recently recorded with somebody who really knows his stuff about all of this, Clark Williams-Derry. He works with the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. And we recently recorded an episode with him where he talks exactly about this, about the fact that gas is not replacing coal abroad. And I think Mari will put that into the chat now or later, or it's there already. Okay, thanks, Mari. So those are the environmental consequences of liquefied natural gas, but there are a lot of health impacts as well. In fact, our next webinar is going to be focused on the climate and health connections, where we're going to have some doctors and nurses and experts talking about the health impacts in much greater detail. But research has found really staggering rates of health issues in folks who live near fracking sites. Everything from birth defects to asthma to childhood leukemia, even death. So this is quite severe. And it's not only for those who live near fracking sites, but natural gas also causes indoor air pollution. So if you heat your home with gas or you have a gas stove, what's happening is that nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, even benzene, which is carcinogenic, are leaking. And in fact, gas stoves can continue to emit these things even when they're turned off, which is honestly very terrifying. And I think a lot of people aren't really aware of this. Yeah, there's a stat here that 1 in 8 cases of pediatric asthma in the US is linked to air pollution caused from gas stoves. And the gas industry certainly does not want us to be aware of that fact. Moving on to affordability impacts as well. So there's climate impacts, there's health impacts, and it's also affecting us, our wallets in addition. I'm sure we all know that affordability has been a key concern for many. It's reached crisis levels, and yet we are seeing that gas and electricity prices are going up already due to pipelines. If you are a FortisBC customer, you might have noticed that back in February, your gas bills went up as much as 17%. Why is this? It's because Fortis has to pay for new pipelines. They are working on the Eagle Mountain pipeline, which will be connected to the wood fiber LNG project that I mentioned, being built in Squamish. And so we are paying for these projects. We also know that LNG exports will be worsening the affordability crisis for individuals, for businesses, and the BC budget, which came from the BC government itself, predicts that there will be a 113% increase in the price of gas this year. Again, I think that's something they try to slip under the radar. I don't think that that's the sort of thing that they are widely advertising. In Australia and in the United States, once these countries began exporting LNG, a trend became apparent wherein domestic gas prices started going up. In Australia, they tripled. And the thing is that these are very different contexts than the Canadian context. And so we can't say that the exact same thing is going to happen, but we do know for sure, and the podcast episode talks about this, that once gas companies begin exporting LNG, they are able to make profits by raising the price of gas locally. That happened in other countries, and so it seems likely that it's going to be happening here as well. Now, if all of this is not enough to convince you that fracked gas is not a good thing, we also can see that there are economic impacts. So the business case for LNG is quickly weakening. If you're a business person or an economist and you know you're spreading the type of messaging of like, well, there may be environmental impacts, there may be health impacts, but this is good for the economy. Actually, we can see that that is not the case. By the end of this decade, projections are showing an oversupplied global LNG market. The fact is that BC is coming into this market very late in the game. There are other countries like Russia, the US, Qatar, who have been exporting LNG for years now. And then we're kind of coming up behind and saying, well, we want to do it too. But they can do it more cheaply. They've been already operating. They have the infrastructure in place. And we are still far behind as we're trying to hurriedly build our own infrastructure, but it takes years. It could take up to a decade to build a new pipeline. So we're also seeing the demand for natural gas going down. And it's very likely, as you can see, that we're going to be having more LNG supply than is needed, than is demanded, while global renewable energy generation capacity is going up. So all of this put together means the economic case is really not looking good. And it's possible that we'll end up with stranded assets, meaning perhaps we will have the terminals and the pipelines built, either fully built or halfway built, before the government realizes that this is actually not going to work, and we will be left to foot the bill. Now, the final type of impact I want to discuss is something that maybe folks are less aware of, which is the connections to mega billionaires. LNG in BC is being advanced by American investors, many of whom are closely allied with the Trump administration. So with the Prince Rupert gas transmission pipeline that I mentioned at the very beginning, this pipeline is 50% owned by Western LNG, which is based in Texas. One of their main investors is the notorious private equity firm Blackstone Inc. Blackstone's CEO, this gentleman on the left, Steve Schwarzman, donated more than $39 million to the 2024 presidential race in support of Trump's agenda. The Silizum's terminal, which is the one that we're expecting to hear about any day now, is in fact 100% American owned. It is not Indigenous owned, as the BC government continues to say it is. It is American owned. And let's keep in mind that our premier keeps telling us that this is the time to distance ourselves from the US, to de-link our economies, and yet they are pushing through this fossil fuel infrastructure that will be directly lining the pockets of American investors, not only just American investors, but American investors who are closely tied to Trump. This is not the direction that BC should be going in. I don't think the majority of British Columbians would be too happy if they knew that this is what is happening, that this is what the government is putting forward. And that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this webinar and why we're doing this whole series, is to help educate folks so that they feel more equipped to be talking about this, so they know what's going on, and so you can take some action, which leads into the next slide, calls to action. And I know that we're getting close to the end here and I want to have some time for questions, but if you've been listening to all of this tonight and you feel inspired and you feel angry and you feel like, wow, I want to do something, we tried to come up with as many options for you as possible. So first of all, if you're feeling like, wow, I want to get involved with some sort of direct actions on the ground, there will be a link to that. Thank you, Mari, for putting that into the chat. You can visit this website and get involved. If you want to become a signatory of the BC Climate Emergency Campaign, that will give you access to the other groups who are a part of the campaign. You can either sign on to become a signatory and leave it at that, or you can get more involved. And that will then allow you some more opportunities to work with us against LNG. There's an organization called Decolonial Solidarity, which they created this wonderful open letter signed by 120 faith leaders. It's specifically signed by faith leaders to the government, which is they're opposing fossil fuel projects and particularly calling for Indigenous sovereignty. So if you are a faith leader or you know someone who is a faith leader, we would really encourage you to send them this letter and to sign on. Meeting with your MLA is another fantastic thing that we would really encourage you to do, because it's so important that our elected officials are hearing from constituents that they care about climate action, that they care about what is going on. If you have never met with your MLA before and you have no idea what that entails, we are so happy to walk you through every step of the way. And we will train you and talk to you and give you advice and all the information that you would need. Finally, if you want to learn more about LNG, we have a few last resources that you can check out. And I really encourage you to do so because this was a short webinar and there's so much more to know, but we tried to keep it as brief and yet thorough as we could. So that concludes that portion of the webinar, which brings us into the Q&A. And we're nearly at the end here, nearly at the hour. I am just trying to take a look at the chat here to see if we have any questions. And mostly I'm seeing Mari putting in all of these resources. Thank you, Mari, for being on that. Maybe I'll pass it to an earlier question from the beginning, which was directed towards Maryam, which was about, can you share more about your work that you've been doing on Musqueam lands?
Definitely. Thank you, Diane, for the question. When I was talking about work on Musqueam land, I was kind of speaking more broadly about any of the work that we do if we are on unceded Musqueam land is work on Musqueam land. So that's kind of what I was referring to. But if you're wondering about specific action, that you could get involved in, something that I've been doing a lot. I live next to UBC, and something I've been doing is going to the Center for Indigenous Land-Based Education, Research and Wellness at Witsitsism. It's kind of a long name, but you can just call it Witsitsism. It's basically a garden space on the UBC farm, and they are open to volunteers. Generally, you want to get in touch before you go volunteer, just so that they know you're coming for first time, because they do a little walkthrough. But it's a really great space. I spent a lot of time there this summer, and it's a really great way to kind of learn from the land and be really engaged with growing foods and eating those foods. They bring a lot of the foods that they grow to Musqueam elders, so it's kind of a direct way to be involved in land-based learning and reconciliation. So that's something that is kind of a more tangible action, I guess, that I've been doing.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. If anyone else has any questions, this is your chance. Are there links about the work done by the 3 speakers? I believe we are going to share their email addresses, and we can also share websites if that's helpful. I will compile all of these resources that we've shared tonight into an email and send that out, so you don't have to worry about quickly opening everything. So yeah, that's a great point that we can include that in the email. I know I threw so much information at everyone tonight, so maybe your brain is a little frazzled. If there aren't any other questions, then that will bring our webinar to an end. And I will do, again, a quick plug about our next one, which is about the health impacts specifically around LNG. And that is on October 1st at the same time, 7 to 8 p.m. And I want to just thank you all so much for being here. It means something to have you here. It means that you have passion for this work and you care enough to dedicate your evening to learning more about it. Talking about what you've learned tonight is one of the most impactful things that you can do, because not enough people know about what's happening in BC with LNG. And it's we know that it's going to get worse before it gets better. So keep your eyes and ears open and continue to stay curious and open to learning as you all are. I appreciate it so much. And I want to say a final, just huge thank you to Reverend Harold, to Abhay, and to Maryam for spending your time with us. Oops. Your words were very inspiring and hopeful. And I hope everybody leaves tonight feeling a little bit better than they did coming into it. So thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your evening.